What people get wrong about the Council of Nicaea, the controversial truth. The year is 325 AD and something extraordinary is about to happen. Picture this. Hundreds of bishops from across the Roman Empire are gathering in the lakeside city of Nicaea, summoned by none other than Emperor Constantine himself. The air is thick with anticipation, political tension, and theological debate that will supposedly reshape Christianity forever. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind today. Almost everything you think you know about the Council of Nicaea is wrong. And I mean spectacularly, historically wrong. If you've ever heard that this is where Christians decided what books belonged in the Bible, that's false. If you think Constantine forced his own religious beliefs onto the assembled bishops, completely incorrect. And if you believe this council invented the idea that Jesus is God or created the Trinity out of thin air, you're buying into myths that have been debunked by serious historians for decades. But there's one misconception about Nicaea that's even more pervasive, more deeply embedded in how we understand early Christianity, and frankly more shocking when you realize the truth. It's the idea that the Council of Nicaea was this decisive, history-changing moment where everything got settled once and for all. Today, I'm going to show you why that narrative is not just wrong, but dangerously misleading. We're going to dive deep into what actually happened at Nicaea, what came after, and why understanding this correctly changes everything you thought you knew about early Christian history. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that textbooks don't want to tell you. If you had been alive in the decades following the Council of Nicaea, you wouldn't have looked back at 325 as some pivotal watershed moment. In fact, you might have thought the Council's decisions were losing. Let me paint you a picture of just how wrong our popular understanding really is. The standard story goes something like this. There was this major theological dispute brewing about the nature of Jesus Christ. A priest named Arius was teaching controversial ideas about Jesus being subordinate to God the Father. The bishops couldn't agree, so Constantine called a council. They met, they debated, they voted, they created the Nicene Creed, and boom, Arianism was defeated. Orthodox Christianity triumphed. End of story. Except that's not even remotely what happened. That's like saying World War II ended at Pearl Harbor because America entered the fight. The Council of Nicaea wasn't the climax of this theological controversy. It was barely even the opening act. But before we get into what really happened, we need to understand what this fight was actually about, because even that gets misrepresented constantly. The dispute that rocked the Christian world in the early 4th century centered around a fundamental question. What exactly is the relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ? Now, both sides agreed that Jesus was divine. Both sides believed in the Trinity. Both sides acknowledged that Jesus was the Son of God. The disagreement was far more nuanced than most people realize. Bishop Alexander of Alexandria taught that Jesus, as the Son of God, was co-eternal with the Father. In other words, there was never a time when the Son did not exist alongside the Father. They were both equally eternal, equally divine, existing together from all eternity. Arius, one of Alexander's priests, found this problematic. He argued that if Jesus is truly the Son, then logically the Father must have existed before the Son. There had to be some sense in which the Father came first, then begat the Son, and through the Son created everything else. Now, this gets complicated because Arius wasn't talking about Jesus being created within time. He believed the Son was begotten before time itself existed. But the key point was that in Arius's understanding, the Father had some form of priority over the Son. Here's what's fascinating. This wasn't some abstract theological debate that only mattered to scholarly monks in ivory towers. But it also wasn't the kind of dispute that ordinary people were losing sleep over. When Constantine first encountered this controversy after conquering the eastern part of the Roman Empire, his reaction was basically, "Are you kidding me? This is what you're fighting about?" He wrote a letter to both Alexander and Arius, essentially telling them they were being ridiculous. He said there was barely any difference between their positions, that these were abstract questions far removed from real life, and that they should just agree to disagree and move on. And Constantine wasn't alone in this reaction. We have records from other 4th century writers who looked at this dispute and basically said, both sides believe in the Trinity. Both sides believe the Father and Son are distinct persons. Why exactly are they fighting? This tells us something crucial. The significance of this debate wasn't immediately obvious even to intelligent, educated people living at the time. The nuances mattered intensely to the bishops and clergy who understood the theological implications, but to many others, including the emperor himself, it seemed like splitting hairs. So Constantine, who frankly couldn't care less which side won as long as they picked a side and stuck with it, decided to call a council to settle the matter once and for all. This wasn't the first church council in Christian history. Bishops had been meeting in councils for centuries to discuss various issues. But this was the first time bishops from across the entire Roman Empire were summoned to meet together in one place. The council convened in 325, and it wasn't just about the Arian controversy. They also dealt with disciplinary matters, questions about how to treat Christians who had compromised their faith during the recent persecutions, and the thorny issue of when to celebrate Easter, because different Christian communities were literally celebrating Easter on different days, leading to the awkward situation where some Christians were still fasting while others were already feasting. But yes, the Arian question was the big theological issue on the table. After extensive debate, the bishops voted overwhelmingly in favor of Alexander's position. They crafted what we now call the Nicene Creed, which included the crucial Greek term homoousion, meaning of the same essence, or consubstantial. Pontel. This was the word that really stuck in the throats of the Arian party, because to them, it sounded dangerously close to a heresy called Sabellianism, which collapsed the distinction between the Father and the Son. Most bishops signed on to this creed, but a handful refused, including Arius himself and a couple of prominent bishops. These holdouts were promptly exiled by imperial decree. And this is where most people think the story ends. Council held, decision made, dissidents exiled, orthodoxy established, case closed. But that's where the real story actually begins. Because within just 2 years, every single one of those exiled bishops was back. Arius wrote a letter to Constantine with his own statement of faith, basically the Nicene Creed with the controversial homoousion conveniently left out. Constantine read it and said, "Good enough for me," and ordered Arius to be reinstated as a priest. When Arius showed up back in Alexandria expecting to resume his duties, Bishop Alexander took one look at him, realized he hadn't actually changed his theological views one bit, and refused to reinstate him. This kicked off decades, not years, decades, of continued fighting, political maneuvering, and theological warfare that made the original dispute look like a polite disagreement. What followed was a complex web of church councils, imperial politics, and theological intrigue that would dominate Christian discourse for the rest of the 4th century. The Arians didn't just survive the Council of Nicaea, they thrived. They gained political influence, won over emperors, and actually held the upper hand in most subsequent councils. There were councils at Tyre, Sirmium, Sardica, Antioch, and dozens of others where the Arian or semi-Arian position was adopted as official church policy. Meanwhile, the champions of Nicene orthodoxy, like Athanasius, who succeeded Alexander as Bishop of Alexandria, found themselves repeatedly exiled, slandered, and politically outmaneuvered. The irony is almost painful. The council that was supposed to settle the Arian question once and for all barely slowed it down. If anything, it gave the controversy imperial legitimacy and set the stage for an even bigger, more protracted fight. This is why I say that if you had been alive in, say, 340 or 350 AD, you would not have looked back at the Council of Nicaea as some decisive victory for Orthodox Christianity. You might have seen it as the beginning of a theological war that the Orthodox side was actually losing. The semi-Arians, who tried to split the difference by saying the Father and Son were of similar essence rather than same essence, gained significant traction. The difference in Greek was literally one letter, homoousios versus homoiousios, but it represented a compromise that many found appealing. And here's the kicker. For most of the 4th century, it was the Arian and semi-Arian positions that had imperial backing. Constantine's successors, particularly his son Constantius II, favoured these compromise positions precisely because they seemed less divisive. The Nicene party found itself increasingly marginalised and persecuted. This continued for over 50 years. 50 years! The Council of Nicaea, far from ending the controversy, had simply given it a new arena and new political dimensions. The real turning point didn't come until 380 AD, when Emperor Theodosius took the throne, and for the first time, the Roman Empire had a ruler who was both Christian and actually cared about which version of Christianity was true. Theodosius was a committed supporter of Nicene Christianity, and he used imperial power to suppress Arianism and promote orthodoxy. He called the Council of Constantinople in 381, which reaffirmed and slightly expanded the Nicene Creed, and from that point forward, Nicene Christianity became the official, enforced doctrine of the Roman Empire. But even then, the story doesn't end, because Arianism had already spread beyond the empire's borders to the Germanic tribes, who would later conquer much of the Western Empire while holding to Arian beliefs. It took centuries for those Arian kingdoms to finally convert to Nicene Christianity. So, when we step back and look at the big picture, what do we see? The Council of Nicaea was symbolically important. It marked the first time a Christian emperor had convened a church council, which was hugely significant for bishops who had lived through decades of persecution. It produced a creed that would eventually become central to Christian orthodoxy. But as a decisive historical moment that changed the course of Christianity, that's simply not supported by the evidence. The real watershed moment was 380, not 325. The real victory for Nicene Christianity came through imperial enforcement, not theological persuasion. And the real story of this controversy is not about a single council settling a dispute, but about decades of political and theological struggle that reshaped both Christianity and the Roman Empire. This is why getting the Council of Nicaea right matters so much. It's not just about correcting historical misconceptions, though that's important enough. It's about understanding how religious and political power actually interact, how theological controversies really get resolved, and why the stories we tell ourselves about pivotal moments in history often obscure more than they reveal. The Council of Nicaea wasn't the end of anything. It was barely even the beginning. What's even more remarkable is how the traditional narrative completely misses the human drama that was actually unfolding during these decades of theological warfare. Because while we tend to think of ancient church controversies as dry academic debates, what was really happening was a series of political conspiracies, character assassinations, and power plays that would make modern Washington, D.C. look tame by comparison. Take Eusebius of Nicomedia, one of the bishops who was exiled after refusing to sign the Nicene Creed. This wasn't just any bishop. He had direct access to Emperor Constantine. And when he came back from exile in 327, he didn't just quietly resume his duties. He launched what can only be described as a systematic campaign to destroy his opponents and advance the Arian cause throughout the empire. The man was brilliant, ruthless, and politically connected in ways that made him incredibly dangerous to the Nicene party. He used his relationship with Constantine to whisper poison in the emperor's ear about Athanasius and other Nicene leaders. He orchestrated smear campaigns, trumped up charges, and manipulated church councils to get his enemies removed from power. And it worked. spectacularly. Athanasius, who should have been the hero of this story if the traditional narrative were true, spent most of his career running for his life. He was exiled not once, not twice, but 5 separate times through the political machinations of the Arian party. 5 times. This is the man who supposedly represented the winning side of the Council of Nicaea. Think about what that means. If Nicaea had really been this decisive victory for Orthodox Christianity, how exactly does the chief defender of Nicene theology end up getting kicked out of his own city 6 times? How does he spend years hiding in the Egyptian desert while his enemies control the major churches of the empire? The answer is simple. Because the Council of Nicaea hadn't actually won anything. It had just given the controversy a new stage and new rules to play by. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. Eusebius of Nicomedia didn't just have political influence. He had theological influence too. And in one of history's great ironies, when Constantine was on his deathbed in 337, guess who was called in to perform the emperor's baptism? That's right. Eusebius of Nicomedia, the Arian bishop who had been exiled for refusing to accept the Council of Nicaea's decisions. So the emperor who convened the council that was supposed to defeat Arianism ended up being baptized by an Arian. You literally cannot make this stuff up. This pattern repeated itself throughout the 4th century. The Arians weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They were winning converts, gaining political appointments, and most importantly, they were winning the battle for imperial favor. Constantine's son, Constantius II, who ruled the Eastern Empire for decades, was sympathetic to Arian and semi-Arian positions. Not because he was a deep theological thinker, like his father he mostly just wanted the bishops to stop fighting, but because the Arian party presented itself as the reasonable, moderate, compromise position, and from a political standpoint, that made perfect sense. The semi-Arian formula that the father and son were of similar essence rather than identical essence sounded like a reasonable middle ground. Why insist on precise theological language that seemed to create more problems than it solved? Why not find a formula that everyone could live with? This is exactly what happened at the Council of Sirmium in 357, where a semi-Arian creed was adopted that explicitly rejected the use of the word essence altogether. The assembled bishops declared that such technical language was unbiblical and unnecessarily divisive. They essentially said, let's just stick to biblical terminology and stop fighting over philosophical concepts. From a modern perspective, this sounds incredibly reasonable. But from the Nicene party's perspective, it was a complete capitulation to Arianism disguised as moderation. What's fascinating is how this political dynamic shaped the theological debate itself. The Arian party learned to present their views not as a rejection of Nicaea, but as a more biblical, more moderate, more reasonable alternative to what they portrayed as Nicene extremism. They argued that the word homoousion, the key term from the Nicene Creed, wasn't found in Scripture and had been used by heretics in the past. They pointed out that it could be interpreted in ways that collapse the distinction between father and son. They positioned themselves as defenders of biblical language against philosophical speculation. This strategy was incredibly effective. Throughout the 340s, 350s, and 360s, council after council adopted Arian or semi-Arian formulations. The Nicene party found itself increasingly isolated and marginalized. But here's what makes this story even more complex. The Arian party wasn't monolithic. There were different factions with different theological positions, and they spent almost as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Nicenes. You had the hardcore Arians who maintained that the Son was a creature, fundamentally different from the Father. You had the semi-Arians who tried to find middle ground by saying the Son was like the Father in essence. You had another group called the Homoians, who said the Son was simply like the Father according to Scripture, without getting into questions of essence at all. These groups formed shifting alliances and coalitions depending on the political situation. Sometimes they would unite against the Nicenes. Sometimes they would fight each other for imperial favor. The theological landscape was incredibly fluid and complex. And through it all, the Nicene party was learning some hard lessons about how theological truth relates to political power. They discovered that having the correct theology means absolutely nothing if you can't build coalitions, influence emperors, and outmaneuver your opponents in the corridors of power. This is where figures like Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus become crucial to the story. These were the Cappadocian Fathers, a group of brilliant theologians who figured out how to combine theological sophistication with political savvy. They realized that the Nicene party had been making a critical error. They had been so focused on defending the precise language of the Nicene Creed that they had alienated potential allies who agreed with them on substance but had problems with specific terminology. The Cappadocians developed a more flexible approach. They were willing to work with semi-Arian bishops who were genuinely concerned about preserving the distinction between Father and Son. They found ways to explain how Nicene theology could address those concerns without compromising the essential point about the Son's full divinity. This was theological diplomacy of the highest order. They were building bridges, creating coalitions, and gradually winning over bishops who had been suspicious of Nicene theology. But even with these brilliant strategic moves, the Nicene party was still fighting an uphill battle against imperial policy and established church hierarchy. The breakthrough didn't come through theological argument or political maneuvering. It came through a completely external factor, a change of emperor. When Theodosius became emperor in 379, everything changed overnight. For the first time since Constantine, the Roman Empire had a ruler who was not only Christian, but had strong personal convictions about which form of Christianity was true. Theodosius was a committed Nicene Christian from day one. He didn't need to be convinced or converted or politically maneuvered. He simply used imperial power to enforce what he believed to be correct doctrine. In 380, he issued an edict declaring that all his subjects should follow the form of Christianity taught by the bishops of Rome and Alexandria. In other words, Nicene Christianity. Anyone who disagreed would be considered a heretic and face legal consequences. This was the real turning point. Not theological debate, not church councils, not brilliant apologetics. Imperial decree backed by state power. The Council of Constantinople in 381 was really just a victory celebration. The assembled bishops reaffirmed the Nicene Creed, added some language about the Holy Spirit to address other theological controversies that had emerged, and basically declared the Arian controversy over. And in a sense, it was over, at least within the Roman Empire. Arian bishops were removed from their positions, Arian churches were closed, and Arian theology was driven underground. But here's the final twist in this already twisted story. Just as Arianism was being crushed within the empire, it was spreading like wildfire outside the empire's borders. Arian missionaries had been incredibly successful in converting the Germanic tribes beyond the Roman frontier. Ulfilas, one of the most effective Arian bishops of the 4th century, had translated the Bible into Gothic and established thriving Arian churches among the Visigoths. So when these Germanic tribes began conquering the Western Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries, they brought their Arian Christianity with them. Suddenly you had Arian kings ruling over predominantly Nicene populations across what had been the heartland of the Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Vandals in North Africa. All of them were Arian Christians who now controlled territories where Nicene Christianity had been dominant for generations. This created a completely new dynamic. Instead of Arians and Nicenes fighting for control of the same churches, you now had Arian ruling elites governing Nicene subjects. It was a religious and political arrangement that would persist for centuries. The final conversion of these Germanic kingdoms to Nicene Christianity happened gradually over hundreds of years. The Franks converted in the late 5th century, the Visigoths in the late 6th century, the Lombards in the 7th century. The process wasn't complete until well into the medieval period. So when we zoom out and look at the big picture, what do we see? A theological controversy that began in the early 4th century and wasn't fully resolved until the early medieval period. A dispute that shaped not just Christian theology, but the entire political landscape of post-Roman Europe. And at the center of it all, the Council of Nicaea, not as the decisive moment when everything was settled, but as one episode in a centuries-long struggle that would reshape both Christianity and European civilization. The implications of getting this story right go far beyond correcting historical misconceptions. When we understand how the Arian controversy really played out, we see something crucial about how religious change actually happens in history. It's not usually through dramatic council meetings where truth suddenly triumphs over error. It's through decades of political maneuvering, coalition building, imperial favor, and sometimes just dumb luck. Theological truth matters, but it doesn't exist in a political vacuum. The right side doesn't always win just because it's right. This is a lesson that applies far beyond ancient church history. Every time we see religious or ideological conflicts in our own time, we need to remember that the outcome isn't determined solely by which side has the better arguments. Politics, power, timing, and circumstances all play crucial roles in determining which ideas succeed and which ideas fail. The Council of Nicaea also reveals something uncomfortable about how we construct historical narratives. We love clean stories with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. We want pivotal moments where everything changes, heroes who triumph over villains, decisive battles that settle things once and for all. But real history is messier than that. It's full of false starts, reversals, unintended consequences, and outcomes that nobody saw coming. The Arian controversy perfectly illustrates this messiness, and that's exactly why the traditional narrative gets it so wrong. Consider how different the story looks when you follow the actual timeline instead of the mythologized version. In 325, the Council of Nicaea supposedly defeats Arianism. But by 327, all the exiled Arian leaders are back in power. By 335, Athanasius, the great defender of Nicene orthodoxy, is in exile for the first time. By 337, Constantine is being baptized by an Arian bishop. If you were writing a movie script about this, your editor would reject it for being completely unbelievable. The supposed winners keep losing, the supposed losers keep winning, and nobody can figure out what's actually happening. But that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating and so important to understand correctly. Because this pattern of theological controversy, mixed with political intrigue, wasn't unique to the 4th century. It's how religious change has always worked throughout history. Look at the Protestant Reformation. The standard narrative presents it as Martin Luther nailing his theses to the church door in 1517, sparking a religious revolution that swept across Europe. But the reality was decades of complex political maneuvering, shifting alliances between princes and popes, wars that had as much to do with territorial control as theological conviction, and outcomes that varied dramatically from region to region based on local circumstances. Or consider the Great Schism between Eastern and Western Christianity in 1054. The popular story treats it as a single dramatic moment when the churches split over theological differences. But historians now understand it as a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, driven by cultural differences, political rivalries, and competing claims to authority that had little to do with pure theology. The same pattern repeats throughout religious history. The Council of Trent, the English Reformation, the rise of Pentecostalism, the Second Vatican Council. None of these pivotal moments in Christian history worked the way the simplified narratives suggest. They were all complex, drawn-out processes with multiple false starts, unexpected reversals, and outcomes shaped as much by politics and circumstance as by theological conviction. This is why the Council of Nicaea matters so much as a case study. It forces us to confront the gap between how we think religious change happens and how it actually happens. It challenges our assumptions about the relationship between truth and power, between theological correctness and historical success. But there's an even deeper lesson here about the nature of religious authority itself. The Arian controversy reveals how fragile and contested religious authority really was in the early Christian centuries, despite the confident claims we often hear about apostolic succession and unbroken tradition. Think about it. If the bishops at Nicaea were really the authoritative interpreters of Christian doctrine, if they really spoke with the voice of the Church Universal, then why did their decisions carry so little weight? Why were they so easily reversed and ignored? The answer is that religious authority in the 4th century was still very much up for grabs. Different bishops claimed different sources of legitimacy. Some appealed to apostolic succession, others to theological learning, still others to imperial favor or popular support. There was no universally accepted mechanism for resolving disputes or determining who had the right to speak for Christianity as a whole. This is completely different from how we usually think about early Christian authority. The standard narrative presents a clear hierarchy. Jesus appointed the apostles appointed bishops, the bishops carried on the tradition, and councils spoke with the collective voice of the church. Challenge this system and you're challenging Christianity itself. But the actual history shows a much more fluid, contested, and frankly chaotic situation. Bishops were constantly fighting with each other about who had authority over whom. Councils contradicted other councils. Imperial intervention could overturn decades of theological development overnight. The Arian controversy exposes all of this because it lasted long enough and involved enough people that we can see the full complexity of how religious authority actually worked in practice. And what we see is not a smooth, hierarchical system, but a messy political process where different groups competed for legitimacy using whatever resources they had available. The Arians were incredibly sophisticated about this. They didn't just make theological arguments, they built political networks, cultivated imperial favor, appealed to popular sentiment, and used every available lever of power to advance their cause. They understood that being right wasn't enough. You also had to be strategically smart. The Nicene Party learned this lesson the hard way. Early on, they seemed to think that having the correct theology would be enough to guarantee victory. They were repeatedly blindsided by the political savvy of their opponents. It took them decades to figure out how to combine theological conviction with effective political strategy. This dynamic completely undermines the idea that early Christian doctrine developed through some kind of pure, apolitical process of theological reflection. Politics was baked into the system from the very beginning. Imperial favor, personal rivalries, ethnic tensions, economic interests, all of these factors shaped how Christian doctrine developed. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the theological outcomes were wrong or that political considerations invalidate religious truth claims. But it does mean that we can't pretend the process was somehow above or beyond normal human political dynamics. And this brings us to one of the most important implications of getting the Nicaea story right. It changes how we think about religious certainty and theological development more broadly. The traditional narrative encourages a kind of historical triumphalism. It suggests that Orthodox Christianity emerged through a straightforward process where truth gradually overcame error, where the Holy Spirit guided the church to correct conclusions, where the good guys won because they were good. But the actual story of the Arian controversy suggests something much more complex and honestly more humble. It suggests that theological development is a messy, contingent, deeply human process, where outcomes depend as much on circumstances and strategy as on the inherent truth or falsehood of competing ideas. This doesn't mean we have to become complete relativists about religious truth, but it does mean we should be much more cautious about claiming that particular theological positions are obviously correct, or that the historical victory of certain ideas proves their validity. Consider what might have happened if Theodosius had been an Arian instead of a Nicene Christian, or if Constantine had lived longer and remained sympathetic to Arian positions, or if the Germanic tribes had converted to Nicene rather than Arian Christianity before conquering the Western Empire. Any of these scenarios could have led to completely different theological outcomes. Arianism might have become the dominant form of Christianity, with Nicene theology relegated to the status of an ancient heresy. The entire trajectory of Christian doctrine and practice could have been fundamentally different. This kind of counterfactual thinking isn't just an academic exercise. It's a crucial corrective to the assumption that history unfolded the way it did, because it had to unfold that way. It reminds us that the Christianity we know today is the product of countless contingent historical developments, not the inevitable result of theological truth triumphing over error. And this has profound implications for how we approach contemporary religious and theological questions. If the development of Christian doctrine was as contingent and politically shaped as the Arian controversy suggests, then maybe we should be less confident about our ability to determine definitive answers to complex theological questions. Maybe we should be more humble about claiming that our particular theological positions are obviously correct, or that disagreement necessarily indicates error or bad faith. Maybe we should be more aware of how our own cultural and political contexts shape our theological convictions. The Arian controversy also reveals something crucial about the relationship between Christianity and political power. One of the most striking aspects of the whole story is how quickly and completely imperial favor could reshape the theological landscape. When Constantine favored compromise positions, suddenly semi-Arianism looked like the wave of the future. When Theodosius favored Nicene orthodoxy, Arianism was crushed almost overnight. The theological arguments didn't change, but the political context did, and that made all the difference. This pattern has repeated throughout Christian history. The rise of Protestantism was as much about political conflicts between princes and popes as it was about theological disagreements. The spread of Christianity in the developing world has been shaped by colonialism, nationalism, and economic development as much as by missionary activity. Understanding this doesn't require cynicism about religious conviction or motivation. Many of the key figures in the Arian controversy, on both sides, were genuinely committed to their theological positions and willing to suffer for them. Athanasius spent years in exile rather than compromise his beliefs. Arian bishops faced persecution and death rather than abandon their convictions. But personal sincerity doesn't eliminate the role of political factors in shaping religious outcomes. Even the most committed believers have to navigate political realities if they want their theological convictions to have any practical impact. This is why the Council of Nicaea story matters so much for understanding Christianity in the modern world. We're living through another period of rapid religious change, where traditional authorities are being challenged, where new technologies are reshaping how religious communities form and function, where political and cultural conflicts are deeply intertwined with theological disagreements. The lessons from the 4th century are directly relevant to these contemporary dynamics. Religious change happens slowly and unpredictably. Political factors matter as much as theological arguments. Authority is always contested and contingent. Outcomes depend on strategic thinking and coalition building, not just on having the right ideas. And perhaps most importantly, the winners and losers in religious controversies aren't determined by some abstract process of truth conquering error. They're determined by complex interactions between ideas, institutions, personalities, and circumstances that are impossible to predict in advance. This doesn't mean religious truth doesn't matter or that all theological positions are equally valid, but it does mean we should approach religious controversies with more humility, more awareness of our own limitations, and more respect for the complexity of how religious change actually happens. The Council of Nicaea teaches us that getting the history right isn't just about academic accuracy. It's about understanding the real dynamics of religious development in ways that can help us navigate our own theological and political challenges more wisely. Because if there's one thing the Arian controversy proves beyond any doubt, it's that religious history is far stranger, more complex, and more surprising than any of the simplified narratives we tell ourselves. And that's exactly why it's so important to get the story right. So here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn, because we haven't even talked about what happened to Christianity outside the Roman Empire during all of this theological chaos. And when you see how this played out, you'll understand just how completely the traditional Nicaea narrative falls apart. Remember Ulfilas. He was one of the most successful Arian missionaries of the 4th century, and while the Nicene and Arian parties were busy fighting each other for control of churches within the empire, he was out beyond the frontier converting entire Germanic tribes to Arian Christianity. This guy was brilliant. He didn't just preach to the Goths, he created a Gothic alphabet, translated the entire Bible into their language, and established a thriving network of Arian churches that stretched across what is now Eastern Europe. While Athanasius was getting exiled for the 5th time, Ulfilas was building a parallel Christian civilization that would outlast the Roman Empire itself. And here's the kicker. When these Germanic tribes started conquering Roman territory in the 5th and 6th centuries, they brought their Arian Christianity with them. Suddenly, you had Arian kings ruling over Nicene populations across huge swathes of what had been the Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy, the Visigoths controlled Spain, the Vandals controlled North Africa, the Burgundians controlled southeastern France. All of them were Arian Christians who now held political power over territories where Nicene Christianity had supposedly triumphed centuries earlier. Think about the implications of this. If the Council of Nicaea had really been this decisive victory for Orthodox Christianity, how exactly do you explain Arian kingdoms controlling Rome itself? How do you explain Arian bishops celebrating communion in the same churches where Nicene bishops had once proclaimed the triumph of orthodoxy? The answer is simple. Because the Council of Nicaea hadn't actually settled anything on a civilizational level. It had just shifted the battleground. What's even more fascinating is how these Arian kingdoms dealt with their Nicene subjects. In most cases, they were remarkably tolerant. The Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy from 493 to 526, allowed Nicene Christians to practice their faith freely while maintaining his own Arian beliefs. He appointed Nicene Christians to important government positions and generally tried to avoid religious conflict. But this created a bizarre situation where the supposedly heretical Arians were often more tolerant than the supposedly orthodox Nicenes had been when they held power. When Theodosius was enforcing Nicene Christianity in the 380s, he had shut down Arian churches and exiled Arian bishops. But when the Arians were in charge, they frequently allowed Nicene Christians to worship freely. This tolerance wasn't necessarily born of theological indifference. Many of these Arian rulers genuinely believed in religious freedom as a matter of principle, but it also reflected political pragmatism. They were minorities ruling over majority populations, so oppressing the majority religion would have been politically suicidal. The result was a complex religious landscape that completely defies the simple narrative of Nicene orthodoxy triumphing over Arian heresy. In many parts of Europe, Arianism remained the dominant form of Christianity for centuries after the Council of Constantinople supposedly ended the controversy. The conversion of these Germanic kingdoms to Nicene Christianity was a gradual process that took hundreds of years and happened for primarily political rather than theological reasons. The Frankish king Clovis converted around 496, partly because his wife was a Nicene Christian and partly because he wanted to gain the support of the Gallo-Roman population he was trying to rule. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain didn't convert until 587, and that was largely because King Recared wanted to unify his religiously divided kingdom under a single form of Christianity. The Lombards in northern Italy held out even longer, with some Lombard dukes remaining Arian well into the 7th century. Each of these conversions was a political calculation as much as a theological decision. The Germanic rulers weren't suddenly convinced that Nicene theology was correct. They were responding to changing political circumstances that made conversion advantageous. And even after the official conversions, Arian influences persisted in ways that historians are still discovering. Some scholars argue that certain aspects of medieval Germanic Christianity retained distinctly Arian characteristics well into the High Medieval period. This is why focusing on the Council of Nicaea as the decisive moment misses so much of the actual story. The real triumph of Nicene Christianity wasn't a 4th century theological victory. It was a centuries-long political and cultural process that had as much to do with the collapse of Roman political structures as it did with theological arguments. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more complex. While Arianism was gradually disappearing in Western Europe, it was actually spreading in other directions. Arian missionaries followed trade routes into Central Asia, established churches among various nomadic peoples, and even reached as far as China. There's evidence of Arian Christian communities existing along the Silk Road well into the medieval period. Some historians believe that certain forms of Nestorian Christianity, which spread widely in Asia, retained theological elements that were closer to Arianism than to Nicene orthodoxy. So we're not just talking about a controversy that lasted 50 years longer than most people think. We're talking about a theological tradition that persisted in various forms for over a millennium across multiple continents. The idea that the Council of Nicaea defeated Arianism is almost laughably inadequate when you consider the global scope of this story. And this brings us to one of the most important points about why getting the Nicaea narrative right matters so much. When we tell the simplified story of orthodox triumph over heretical error, we're not just getting the history wrong, we're perpetuating a fundamentally distorted understanding of how religious ideas actually spread and develop. The real story shows us that theological success has very little to do with theological correctness, and very much to do with political circumstances, cultural adaptation, and historical contingency. Arianism didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because the political winds shifted in ways that favoured its competitors. This has profound implications for how we think about religious authority and theological certainty. If Nicene Christianity prevailed primarily through political means, rather than theological superiority, what does that tell us about claims to religious truth more generally? Consider the counterfactual scenario I mentioned earlier. If Theodosius had been an Arian Christian, if the Germanic tribes had converted to Nicene rather than Arian Christianity, if the Islamic conquests had taken different territories, any of these changes could have led to a completely different theological landscape. We might be living in a world where Arianism was the dominant form of Christianity, and Nicene theology was remembered as an ancient heresy that briefly gained political favour before being rejected by the mainstream church. The theological arguments would be the same, but the historical outcomes would be completely reversed. This kind of thinking is deeply unsettling for anyone who wants to believe that religious truth has some kind of inherent power to triumph over error. But it's essential for understanding how religious change actually works in the real world. And here's where the story gets even more interesting. Because the theological debates that seemed so crucial in the 4th century look very different when you zoom out and consider the broader sweep of Christian development. The specific language that caused so much controversy, whether the Son is of the same essence or of similar essence as the Father, ended up being much less important than the underlying question of how to balance unity and diversity within the Godhead. And that question has continued to generate new controversies and new solutions throughout Christian history. The medieval debates about the filioque clause, whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son, were essentially variations on the same themes that drove the Arian controversy. The Protestant Reformation raised new questions about authority and interpretation that echoed the 4th century struggles over who had the right to define orthodox doctrine. Even contemporary debates about gender, sexuality, and social justice in Christian churches follow similar patterns of theological argument combined with political maneuvering, coalition building, and appeals to various forms of authority. In other words, the Arian controversy wasn't an isolated historical episode that got resolved once and for all. It was an early example of dynamics that have continued to shape Christian development for the past 17 centuries. And this is why understanding what really happened at Nicaea and afterward is so important for anyone trying to make sense of Christianity today. The traditional narrative suggests that theological controversies can be definitively settled through authoritative councils and official creeds. But the actual history shows that theological development is an ongoing, never-ending process where old questions resurface in new forms and supposed settlements turn out to be temporary truces. The bishops at Nicaea thought they were settling the Arian question once and for all. The bishops at Constantinople thought they were putting the finishing touches on a theological system that would endure forever. But history had other plans. This doesn't mean theological reflection is pointless or that religious truth is purely relative. But it does mean we should approach theological controversies with a lot more humility and a lot more awareness of our own historical limitations. The 4th century church leaders were brilliant, dedicated people who cared deeply about getting theology right. They had access to sources and traditions that we've lost. They spoke the original languages of Christian scripture and worship, and yet they couldn't achieve the kind of definitive theological settlement that they thought they were creating. If they couldn't do it, what makes us think we can do it? What makes us think our theological conclusions are more likely to stand the test of time than theirs were? This is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the real story of the Council of Nicaea. Not that theological reflection is impossible, or that religious truth doesn't exist, but that we should approach these questions with appropriate intellectual humility. The bishops who gathered at Nicaea in 325 were trying to solve real problems and answer real questions about the nature of God and the person of Christ. Those problems and questions haven't gone away, but the solutions they thought they had found turned out to be much more provisional and contested than they realized. And if we're honest, the same thing is probably true of our own theological convictions. The ideas that seem obviously correct to us today may look as quaint and outdated to future Christians as some 4th century debates look to us. This doesn't mean we should stop trying to think carefully about theological questions, but it does mean we should hold our conclusions more lightly and be more open to the possibility that we might be wrong about things we're certain we're right about. The real Council of Nicaea, not the mythologized version, but the actual historical event and its complicated aftermath, teaches us that theological development is a messy, ongoing, deeply human process. It's not a series of definitive moments where truth triumphs over error, but a continuous conversation where each generation has to wrestle with fundamental questions in light of their own circumstances and limitations. And that's actually a much more interesting and ultimately more hopeful story than the traditional narrative of decisive councils and settled doctrine, because it means theology is alive, dynamic, responsive to new situations and new insights. It means we're not just passive recipients of ancient wisdom, but active participants in an ongoing conversation about the deepest questions human beings can ask. The bishops at Nicaea were part of that conversation. So were their Arian opponents. So were the Germanic kings who converted from Arianism to Nicene Christianity centuries later. And so are we. Understanding that continuity, seeing ourselves as part of the same ongoing process of theological reflection and development that produced the Nicene Creed, is much more valuable than treating ancient councils as infallible authorities whose decisions settled everything once and for all. Because here's the thing, the conversation isn't over. The questions that drove the Arian controversy are still with us, just in different forms. How do we balance divine transcendence with divine involvement in the world? How do we understand the relationship between unity and diversity within God? How do we navigate the tension between theological precision and pastoral sensitivity? These aren't just ancient problems that got solved in the 4th century. They're permanent features of Christian theological reflection that each generation has to work through in its own way. And when we understand that, the real story of the Council of Nicaea becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a roadmap for how we might approach our own theological challenges with appropriate humility, strategic wisdom, and realistic expectations about what we can and can't achieve. That's the controversial truth about Nicaea that nobody wants to talk about. Not that it was unimportant, but that it was important in completely different ways than most people assume. It wasn't the end of the story. It was barely even the beginning. So there you have it. The real story of the Council of Nicaea, stripped of the myths and misconceptions that have clouded our understanding for centuries. This wasn't the decisive moment when Christianity got sorted out once and for all. It wasn't where the Bible was decided, where Constantine imposed his will, or where orthodox doctrine triumphed over heretical error in some clean, final victory. Instead, what we've uncovered is something far messier, far more human, and honestly far more fascinating. A theological controversy that raged for decades, where the supposed losers kept winning and the supposed winners kept getting exiled. A story where imperial politics mattered more than theological arguments, where timing and circumstances shaped outcomes more than the inherent truth or falsehood of competing ideas. The Council of Nicaea teaches us that religious history doesn't unfold according to neat narratives, where good defeats evil and truth conquers error. It unfolds through complex webs of human ambition, political calculation, strategic alliances, and sheer historical accident. Understanding this doesn't diminish the importance of theological reflection. It just helps us approach it with the humility and realism it deserves. Because if the brilliant, dedicated bishops of the 4th century couldn't settle these questions definitively, despite their access to ancient sources and their deep commitment to getting things right, maybe we should be a bit more modest about our own ability to achieve theological certainty. The conversation they started at Nicaea isn't over. It's still happening today, in different forms and with different stakes, but driven by the same fundamental questions about God, truth, and human understanding. And that's not a problem to be solved. It's the ongoing work of theology itself. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of history's most misunderstood events. If this changed how you think about early Christianity or religious authority more broadly, let me know in the comments. And if you want to explore more myths that need busting, hit that subscribe button, because there are plenty more controversial truths waiting to be uncovered.